Hi guys! Today I'm going to show you a very general way to dry herbs, and you don't need a fancy dehydrator. I'm going to be showing you how to do this with some wild white sage that I foraged. So grab your herbs from wherever you store them, go forage them or clip them from the garden, and hurry back. Now the first thing we want to do is rinse the herbs under cool water to get rid of any dirt and little bugs. Now my herbs are rinsed and I'm just going to pat them with a lint-free towel. And then we want to flip them. We're going to let them air dry for about 20 to 30 minutes. While our herbs are drying, I'm going to talk to you about a few tips when drying herbs. For starters, if you're foraging your herbs or picking them from your garden, it's best to do that in the morning because that's when the oil content of the plant is the highest, and it affects the overall flavor of the herbs when they're done drying. So the higher the oil content, the better the flavor will be. We pat our herbs dry and then let them air dry because if we put them in the oven while they're wet, it affects the time that it will take, and it actually takes longer if they are wet, and the quicker we can dry the herbs, the better the flavor will be also. With that said, some herbs do have different oil content than others, so the higher the oil content is, the longer it's going to take to dry. Now, if you're drying more than one herb at once, you would generally want to put it on the same baking sheet because less dishes, less time, it just makes sense. Now, it's really not great to do that because more pungent herbs can lend their flavors to other herbs, and we really don't want them to mix, so it's best to dry them on separate baking sheets at separate times in the oven. For instance, if you dried oregano with chamomile, your chamomile would have that aroma and a hint of oregano in its flavor. Ideally, we want to dry the herbs at 170 degrees Fahrenheit or 77 degrees Celsius. If your oven doesn't go this low, we just need to make sure that we're not drying them above 200 degrees Fahrenheit or 93 degrees Celsius, because if we do, it'll bake the herbs instead of drying them. For instance, my oven doesn't go as low as 170 degrees Fahrenheit, so I'm putting it on the lowest setting, which is 175 degrees Fahrenheit. Now there's 3 ways you can use an oven to dry herbs. The first option would be a gas oven with an interior pilot light. Now this type of oven is usually warm and dry, so you can simply put the herbs in, leave them overnight, and they should be perfectly dry by morning. The second option is an oven with a convection feature, which is the one I use and will be showing you today. And the third option is a regular oven with no pilot light or convection feature. This one is the trickiest to use since there is no airflow. You'll want to set the oven to 170 degrees Fahrenheit or the lowest setting, and you'll want to prop the door open with a wooden spoon to help with the airflow. You'll want to stir or flip the herbs every 20 minutes, and when you open and close the oven door, that will also help with the airflow. Now this method usually takes much longer than the oven with the convection feature, around 2 hours to completely dry the herbs. Now I'm gonna go check on the herbs. So my herbs are dry now. I actually let them dry about 45 minutes because I do have a bunch of it, and at 30 minutes it was still a little wet. So drying time will vary, just make sure your herbs are completely dry. So now I'm just gonna look through the herbs and check it and remove any brown, damaged, or withered leaves. This is how much I removed from the sage, and I even found this amongst it. So here we have our clean sage that's been removed of any damaged leaves, and now we're gonna put it on a baking sheet lined with parchment paper. When you're drying an abundance of an herb, it's important to do multiple batches if necessary, because you wanna be able to lay it down on the parchment paper with a little bit of room in between the sprigs so that airflow can go through them. I'm gonna be doing 2 different batches for my sage leaves because I have a lot of it. So now I'm just gonna place it on the baking sheet. Here's what it looks like. There's some gaps for airflow, which is what we want. Now I'm gonna place this in the oven for 20 minutes and then flip it and then place it back in the oven for another 20 minutes. The sage has been in there for 20 minutes and I'm gonna go ahead and flip it and then put it back in the oven for another 20 minutes. Feel of your herbs before you put them back in the oven for another 20 minutes. Some herbs, like I said, do dry sooner than others, so your herbs might not need an additional 20 minutes in the oven. Here's our finished dried herb. You can see how brittle and dry it is. I'm gonna take this off the baking sheet and set it aside to cool, and I'm gonna do my second batch. And here's the second batch. Our herb, in my case sage, has been dried and cooled. You can see how it changed colors a bit. It's a very, very pale color. If you're drying an herb that's on any type of stem, you really want to leave the stem on, like I did in this case, because it is so much easier to get the leaves off, and it's a little less messy. Now we're going to remove the leaves from the stem. Not all herbs you dry will be on a woody stem like my sage is. If it does have a woody stem, it's best to leave the leaves on because it is a little bit easier to remove the leaves and it's a little less messy. But for instance, if you're drying parsley, it doesn't have a woody stem, so you'd probably want to remove the stem first, although you can dry it with the stem on if you choose. So to remove the leaves from the stem, I'm just going to run my fingers down the stem and the leaves should pluck right off. We can tell the leaves are done because whenever we touch them, they just kind of break apart and crackle. If for some reason this does hurt your fingers, you can always wear gloves or maybe even use a towel to pull it off, then dust the towel, however you choose. But we just want to make sure that no foreign objects are getting into the herb, such as lint, dust, plastic or rubber if you use the gloves and it breaks maybe. We just want to keep it really pure. A tip though for pulling the leaves off is that you don't want to pull down with this hand. You want to actually just hold it and pull back. To me, it hurts a little bit more if I'm pushing with my hand that's plucking the leaves. Now we're going to store the herb, and I recommend using a glass jar with a lid. You can use mason jars, any old jars that you've saved from pickles, pasta sauce, they all work. We just need to have an airtight container. I really advise against using plastic because there's toxins in plastic that can leak into our food, and the same with the herbs, and we don't want that. So I'm gonna be using this glass jar. I'm pretty sure it was a pickle jar at one point, but who knows. It doesn't matter the size you use as long as you have enough room to store all the herb. This one holds, I think, about 8 cups. I'm not exactly sure, but roughly about 8 cups. Before I go ahead and store this, I just want to mention that you can grind up your herb into a powder form to be used for seasoning immediately. I keep my herbs whole until I do choose to use them, just because they last longer. They can last up to 3 years in whole form, whole dried form, and so that's significantly longer compared to 6 months to a year pushing it if you go ahead and grind it up right now. To grind up the herb, I use a mortar and pestle, but if you don't have one of those, a food processor should work. I'm just not totally sure you'll reach that pure powder form. Now we do want to pack the jar full of the herb, but we don't want to crush it and press down on it, messing up the herb and breaking it apart. So here I have the jar that I filled. This is about as much as I got. You can see I have like half the bowl more, but we can see that it's packed, but there's still some air gaps and the leaves aren't getting crushed. So here I have another jar. It's actually a different jar than the one I used first, but it doesn't matter because it's an airtight sealed glass container. We collect jars around here, so I have a lot of variety. These are the twigs from the herb. So here we have our dried herb, and this, like I said, will last up to 3 years if you leave it in the whole form. And we want to store this in a cool, dark, dry area. Also, whenever we store the herbs, we need to make sure we're not putting it in a storage area like a cupboard or so, above or below a stove or oven, because the heat can damage the herb. We also don't want to be placing it in a damp environment such as a garage or a basement. Thank you guys for watching. If you happen to like this video or found it interesting or even helpful, go ahead and give it a thumbs up, and don't forget to hit the subscribe button so you don't miss any future content. Also, if you guys have any questions, future video suggestions, or requests of an herb for me to show you guys how to dry, leave those in the comments as well. Cheery and Drasta!